Okay, so several people are here, so let us start. So hello and welcome everyone. I'm Coy Dionco. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of the Global Prophetic, the sponsor of this Zoom event. I'm also a professor of theology at Mary Hill School of Theology and at the De La Salle University in Manila. I'm delighted to be moderating this conversation on the Inclusive Liturgy of Destruction. Quite a provocative title, huh? The title of this conversation was taken from a chapter in the book Beyond Innocence and Redemption, Confronting the Holocaust and Israeli Power, Creating a Moral Future for the Jewish People, published 30 years ago by Harper and Row. So yes, so this conversation is part of the celebration, although I don't really want to call it a celebration. It's maybe a remembrance, but yes, a celebration as well. A celebration of this very important and courageous book. Joining me in this conversation are two brilliant theologians, and let me introduce them now, although they have been talking. Professor Marc H. Ellis is a theologian, speaker, writer, artist. How do you like that? Artist and professor of history and Jewish studies. Professor Ellis founded 3 centers of studies. After receiving his doctorate from Marquette University, he accepted a faculty position at Maryknoll School of Theology in Maryknoll, New York, becoming founding director of their MA program and the Maryknoll Institute for Justice and Peace. So that's the first center. Then in 1998, Professor Ellis joined Baylor and was university professor of Jewish Studies, professor of history, and director of the Center for Jewish Studies. Then the third center was in 2016. After a tour that includes the Philippines, Professor Ellis founded the Center for the Study of the Global Prophetic. Professor Ellis is the author and editor of, here it is, 30 books. So you want to write 30 books, you start waking up at 1 in the morning, including Toward the Jewish Theology of Liberation, Beyond Innocence and Redemption, and his latest, I Am Who Loves the Prophets, an exile devotional, published in the Philippines last February 14, and now out of quarantine. Also joining me in this conversation is Professor Cláudio Carvalhaes. Professor Carvalhaes is a theologian, liturgist, and artist, and a native Brazilian. He completed his PhD in liturgy and theology at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. In the summer of 2016, Dr. Carvalhaes joined Union Theological Seminary as the Associate Professor of Worship. Professor Carvalhaes is a passionate speaker, writer, and performer. He has given academic presentations, performances, and delivered sermons at over 40 conferences, as well as academic societies. Besides the United States, he has lectured in Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Canada, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, and Mozambique. By the way, we have a participant from Gabon, Africa, joining us today. A former student of mine who is assigned in Gabon. Professor Carvalhaes has authored several books, including What Does Worship Have to Do with It? Interpreting Life, Church, and the World Liturgically, and is the editor of Liturgy in Post-Colonial Perspectives, Only One is Holy, which I was able to read. I think Professor Ellis has an article on that book. His latest book, Liturgies from Below, which I hope to read one day, 463 Acts of Worship, Praying with the People at the Ends of the World, is getting great reviews and now has a big following, including the Philippines. So welcome, Professor Marc Ellis and Professor Cláudio Carvalhaes.
Good morning.
Good morning. So good to be here. So good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Coy, for putting this together.
Yeah, it's an honor and privilege to be doing this conversation with you. So let me begin by sharing with the people joining us today the context of this conversation. As I shared with both of you, I thought of doing this conversation to further explore Professor Ellis's thoughts on the inclusive liturgy of destruction. I think it's a powerful and provocative idea, especially with so much death and destruction around. I can think of course, the permanent occupation of Palestine, the pandemic. We now have more than over 1 million people that died due to this pandemic. The destruction of the Amazon, millions of people losing their jobs. You know, there are more than already 200 million who are unemployed globally. The killings everywhere, including the Philippines, as you know, and many others, that gives us a sense that where are we going? It's just darkness on the horizon. So the main question that guides this discussion is, how can or how should we think about all of these things theologically and liturgically? So, so that's the context for this conversation, and this would be the general flow. We'll have a conversation after this introduction, and then we will open it up for interaction and reaction from the people joining us today. So we will have an engaging conversation. Okay, so that's it. So let me just make this into uh, so let me try doing a speaker view. Okay. So I'd like to start with asking Professor Ellis about the idea of an inclusive liturgy of destruction. If Professor Ellis, if you could unpack this for us. Um, what's the inclusive? What is an inclusive liturgy of destruction?
It comes from a book by David Roskies titled Against the Apocalypse, Responses to Catastrophe in Modern Jewish Culture. And the book is a beautiful and haunting book about how Jews make sense of their suffering in the present by referring to ancient archetypes. And which means that the individual suffering has a reference point beyond him or herself.
Mm-hmm.
And the suffering that seems to be meaningless then can take on a kind of meaning. And so an example would be a contemporary Jew who is being displaced from his home, say in Europe during the Nazi period, and remembering the exile. Or a Jew that's on a journey, a forced journey to a promised land, hopefully remembering the Exodus. Or martyrs in Jewish history, which are remembered when a Jew may be martyred. So it's a texture that's given to the individual life, which is a response to the catastrophe that the individual Jew or the Jewish community is going through the lens of Jewish history. And often it's remembered not only in art and in writing, but it assumes a kind of a liturgical sense. So what he means by the liturgy of destruction is that there's a whole history of this now. Not only the event itself, say the exile, but different Jewish exiles. Not only the oppression at a certain point, but oppression against Jews throughout history. And I've often reflected on this in terms of my own life and Jewish life in general. And then I realized going through Jewish literature during the Palestinian Uprising, and sometimes before, where Jews had become empowered, which was new as a collective, that Jews were beginning to remember in what they were seeing they were doing to Palestinians, they were remembering that in the context of Jewish history. So when Jews were seeing Palestinian Arabs being displaced from their homes, that is, sent into exile, there were Jews who were saying, I now remember this because we were sent in exile. So on the one hand, it's an exclusive liturgy of destruction, that is, Jews referring to Jewish history. But what I was beginning to find in my own research and my own experience with Palestinians is that this now included the victims of our empowerment. So I began writing in my book, Beyond Innocence and Redemption, on an inclusive liturgy of destruction. That is, Jews had been oppressed, yes, often. We remember that. Now we finally had power, good, but we were using it to oppress another people. And more than a few Jewish Israelis were writing in their diaries, or sometimes later in newspapers, Israeli newspapers, of how this experience was shaking them back to Jewish history and saying, what in God's name are we doing? What happened to us in God's name? Yeah, what happened to us? Now what are we doing? Now this became quite controversial, and we'll get to that later, I'm sure. But the Liturgy of Destruction is about Jews. When you hear Jews talk about the Holocaust, for instance, and especially a person like Elie Wiesel, who's known throughout the world, that's a liturgical rendering of the experience, not a linear history, but now shared. And how do you include another people that you're oppressing after you were oppressed?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yes. An inclusive liturgy of destruction is it's a reading of history, but not a linear one. So this is a remembrance of events, but in a different way.
It's a deep reading of history, but not only reading. Like with any liturgy, once you're there in that liturgical moment, you're not thinking in a linear way or simply in a rational way. This is going to the core of your being, to the core of your history, to the core of your tradition. So this is the value of tradition. I mean, there are many positive and negative things about tradition, but one of the positive things about tradition is the layering of the individual life within a broader collective one, but also in a broader history. And it's history which gives us meaning, really, and how we place ourselves in history beyond our individual life, or filling out our individual life beyond ourselves. And there are many haunting stories in his book, Against the Apocalypse. But when I met him in Warsaw in 1992 on my way to Auschwitz with a delegation of Jewish rabbis and intellectuals, he didn't like the inclusive. So it's a very, when you start including your victims, it becomes much more controversial. I mean, who are they to be included in our history? Well, my own view was, you oppress another people, they're included. You don't want them included, don't oppress them.
Yeah, that's what makes it so controversial. For example, in your book, you mentioned about Jews who have started incorporating the massacres and the displacement and the dispossession of Palestinians in the celebration of the Passover, for example. So that was very controversial.
Yes, and it depends how you include them too. Sometimes you can include them in a very paternalistic way, and other times you can include them by allowing them to speak themselves. So that's also complex. But the main point is that when Jews are no longer innocent, which we're not now, because our empowerment is not innocent, we take on another layer of tradition that is quite foreign to us. And the sound of it is very jarring, and especially when you don't respect the people you oppress. And of course, that's typical. How do you oppress people that you really respect? So when it came to Palestinian Arabs, from the Jewish perspective, especially the European Jewish and American Jewish perspective, the question was, who are you to include them in our history? Who they don't deserve to be included. And because then there's a racist aspect to it. Who are they? And that they're these uncivilized Arabs and all of these stereotypes. And we're the civilized, but the thing is, the civilized are oppressing the uncivilized. And in the sense that what is civilized? So when I started journeying among Palestinians, I found out that they were quite civilized, and sometimes a lot more civilized than we were, at least the way we were acting.
Yeah,
So
for example, continue, Pastor Ellis.
Yeah, we have this reversal in history. And of course, on the Christian side, when we think of it in a broader way, I've been thinking about it since, getting prepared here. I don't know if it's 2/3 or 3/4 of the Christians in the world have been conquered by Christianity. And what do Christians do? When I go to a Catholic Mass, I think that's a liturgy of destruction. Of course, there's a tack on about the resurrection. My own view is that's a tack on, but that's a very Jewish perspective. But often the people who are celebrating the Mass or who are participating in the Mass have been destroyed, or their culture has been destroyed, or their religion has been destroyed by that very force. So what do you do there? That's even more complicated, because for Christians themselves, even if they were conquered, it's so intimate to themselves and so meaningful. And then if you raise the question, but you were conquered by the religion that's intimate to you, that can be very controversial too. That's for Claudio to talk about, and he can enlighten. But as a Jew looking at Christians and viewing Christians, some of whom are my best friends, I must say, and who understand me at a deep level, for which I'm grateful. This is another question. And then when you get to ecology and how, this destructive force now, what do we do with all that? In now an expanded liturgy of destruction, we have the Jewish sense at the root, in my view, like the prophetic, our indigenous at the root. But it's big, big, big and expanding, and Claudio's posts about the environment and the Amazon. So
Yes, that's right. And I think that's so the Inclusive Liturgy of Destruction initially was for Jews and Palestinians, but actually it also includes the Christians who were, the oppressors of Jews at the beginning, and then so it has become very, expanded. So I'd like to turn now to Professor Claudio. For his response about the inclusive liturgy of destruction.
Thank you, Coy. And let me first name two people who are here whom I admire and have in my heart. Carol Marples, who I don't know where she is now. She was in Scotland. And she's a tremendous artist, and glad to see you here, Carol. Fascinating artist, brilliant, and I wish she was close to me to work together. And here also my Apo Ferdinand Ano, who's one of the best liturgists and liturgical theologians that I know, and is here. So thank you. See, Professor Ellis is there's no way that we read Professor Ellis and are not changed. And the wonderful thing about Professor Ellis' work is that he puts us in a place of restlessness, like the prophetic, right? He puts us in a place that we are never settled. We can never, the aha never comes, because it's always a process, a movement, a transformation. And Professor Ellis is this has this immense ways of thinking that challenges, from his own take on his own tradition. It challenges us all in so many ways. So Professor Ellis has been deeply important to me and to my ways of thinking too, and I count myself as really blessed to have him in my life. So according to liturgies of destructions, I've written some things here just to say about the Christian side of it, and I also have 3 major blocks of questions that I have for him as well.
That's fantastic.
To ask him. I don't know how to go about it, but I don't know if I should go first. Like, let's keep the Christian response for a little later, after we wrestle with his own sense of the liturgies of destruction. Is that okay, Coy?
Sure, sure.
One thing that is fascinating to me is that, you know, when you talk about liturgies, you talk about the identity, right? You talk about that which forms you. Exactly what Professor Ellis just said. Is the core of yourself, right? It happens through the liturgy as well, right? Through the rituals, through the ways in which you shape yourself by doing what you do, and with whom you do, and with what you do. All of this shapes you and forms you and orients you in life. So what Professor Ellis does here is to shift the ground of Jewish identity by adding the Palestinians. So it is very complex what he's offering. Where somebody not from the liturgical field might say, "Oh yeah, it's just another way." No, but no, the only way that it seems like it, and Professor Ellis, you correct me in anything that I'm saying here if I'm getting it right. It seems like the very notion, the very possibility of the Jewish faith or tradition or liturgy has to be now done by way of somebody else, by way of another people. That's the only way that you can recognize yourself, and that that decenters everything. So it's as Christians say, it can only be recognized by Christian, by Buddhism, by Islam, by other religions, and so in that way, it shifts everything, because it shifts memory. It shifts the ways that it shifts your commitments. It shifts your oath, your pledges, and so that is not a small thing when he's saying, well, now by the liturgies of destructions, we have to go to ourselves by way of somebody else. And he clearly says the Holocaust can only be remembered if by way of the Palestinians. So he's putting everything at risk here in his understanding. And so when he mentions the very liturgical day, the Yom HaShoah, which is the special day to recall the untold sufferings of the Jewish people, and in that day, that's the time when you would remember the Holocaust, remember the complexity of the many traditions of the Jewish suffering. But now you can only tell that by ways also of the Palestinians, and I think there's some communities that have picked up. The Rabbi Brent Rosen have taken that up, and if you go to his community, who Professor Ellis is a member of, there's a prayer for Yom HaShoah that he he prays, shelter the souls of all who are oppressed and murdered during the years of the Shoah. And then he goes on, may the memory of those who were singled out, persecuted, and destroyed be sanctified by goodness and for peace. And then he goes into Jews, gays, lesbians, political dissidents, communists, socialists, labor leaders, and Soviet prisoners of war, resistant fighters, Roma, Freemasons, and Jehovah's Witness, the disabled of mind and body, the homeless, the unemployed, the unwanted. So he goes on in this list of people suffer to remember his own faith, his own identity. So I wonder, Professor Ellis, what in this remembering are there boundaries that needs to be kept or not in this remembering, or the boundaries is the borderlessness or of the region? So that's one. Let me give you the two other ones, or you want me to stop and then you
maybe we can focus on that first, Professor Cláudio. Yeah, so that is, I think, very very important, because as we have been we have been defining theology, at least in our conversation with Professor Ellis, theology as the task of nurturing the questions people needs to ask about the history they are creating. And central to that theologizing would be, who will you include and who will you exclude? So it's really a task. And as you said, I think it's very important that you have raised that point. That has something to do with our identity. So so it's a process of who would include, that would also say something about who we are becoming. So I think that's a very important point. And so I'd like to ask Professor Ellis to respond to that.
I like listening to Cláudio unpack my ideas. I learned so much from him. I get these images throughout my whole life, and then other people tell me what they mean, which really helps me understand them. And I think what he's saying here is very important, that it shifts the meaning, the identity of what it means to be Jewish. This inclusive liturgy of destruction that includes Palestinians. So that's, it shifts the ground, it makes it unstable. Jews have an unstable God, and the prophetic, our indigenous, is unstable. So Jews are unstable. Now people this is where Jewish humor comes from, of course, too. The instability of Jewish. And of course, we want to be stable like anyone else. And Israel was supposed to bring that stability. State Zionism did not have as its first point to oppress Palestinians. It was the first point of state Zionism was to make us a normal people, so that Jews would be wealthy and poor. Jews would be artists and they would be imprisoned for crimes. I mean, the whole thing was we wanted Jewish criminals, but to be judged by Jews. And we wanted Jewish maintenance workers and sanitation workers, and Jewish bankers. So the whole idea of Israel was to give us a stable, normal reality. What it's done is it's made us completely unstable in a new way through our abuse of power. Now that identity has shifted, but it wasn't noted liturgically. It wasn't recognized. Well, it was recognized if you look at these diaries of Jews who are displacing Palestinians, even though they want a Jewish state, even if they think it's good, they're also recognizing that they're doing something wrong. And they're recognizing it in light of Jewish history. So when I talk about an inclusive liturgy of destruction, I'm not creating it, I'm naming it. And all theology, it's just like feminism. People like Rosemary Ruther didn't invent feminism. She named what women were experiencing. What I was doing in an inclusive liturgy of destruction was naming what Jews were experiencing, but which theology was trying to deflect. So the shifting of, and so now I've had this image of a dystopic solidarity, and listening to Claudio, I'm thinking of a dystopic Jewishness. Now, here's the other point, and I don't want to monopolize time, but Claudio makes me think a lot. The boundaries. This is very important to me and to everyone in any faith community or political community or ideological community. Boundaries are absolutely essential, and how you define them is very important. So I'm saying Palestinians are inside us. There's no life for us after without including them. And so progressive Jews, some very good Jews say, yeah, Palestinians have been wronged, but now they deserve a state, but we want to build a wall between us so we can go back to our innocence. No, not possible. But what does that mean for Jewishness? And what does it mean that Jews who understand this inclusive liturgy of destruction, sometimes naming it, sometimes not, are in deep exile from the Jewish, mainline Jewish community, and they're never returning. So this is so even how will this be remembered? Who's going to remember my writing, for instance, or the liturgies in Rabbi Rosen's Zedek Chicago? Who's going to remember it? Is Jewish history going to remember it? Or are people like Claudio and you going to remember it with some Jews? So what does that mean? That Claudio can get me to think more deeply about the images I have. How could that be? He's not Jewish. He's Christian. How can he help me understand? So once we admit that these boundaries have shifted, and once we name them, we're in a different ballgame. We're in a different place. What is that place? Now, my last point on this for now is this. I have felt it very important to protect the indigenous prophetic. There's a boundary around it for me, like Mount Sinai. You approach it, but be careful. And those Jews who say, well, I don't want to talk about my Jewishness, I just want to be with others and all, they're actually displaying their Jewishness, aren't they? And like Noam Chomsky, who never talks about Jewish, he's so Jewish, He's such a Jewish exceptionalist, and I love Noam Chomsky, and an American patriot too. So Bob Dylan, he doesn't talk about his Jewishness, can't understand him without it. So Jewishness is very important. But when Roski says to me, basically, who the hell do you think you are, including them, capital T? That's racism, and that's a deflection. Now, a brilliant scholar, oh my God, brilliant scholar. But his deflection, like in all traditions, they try to deflect the next question. So the boundary is on the next question, and Palestinians are our question. And without that, we don't go anywhere except to deflect. And even with progressive Jews and Jews of conscience, even in the synagogue that I'm a member of, when we get to these other issues and they're sort of the same, no, they're not the same. For Jews, Palestinians are the key to everything. As simple as that. But also, Jews are participating, and Israel is participating in a global arms race. Israel's been all over the place in apartheid South Africa, in Central America, in Brazil, all over the place. So Jews are all over the place on the wrong side of history, and Jews are all over the place on the right side of history. What do we do with that? So Claudio is the shifting memory, shifting meaning, shifting boundaries, but we don't want to lose the root of the global prophetic, which I believe is the indigenous Jewish. Now that's a bias, I admit it. But it spread around the world through Christianity and Islam, often conquering people, like in the Philippines, the 500th anniversary of Christianity, conquered. Now there are liberation theologians in the Philippines. And to get to liberation, where do they go? Back to Jewish. How do you liberate Jesus in the Catholic tradition? Liberation theologians? They went back to the Exodus. So we want to make sure that remains, but it can't remain the way it was.
Thank you, Professor Ellis. Yeah, yeah, I think we'll talk about the commemoration of the 500 years of Christianity. I think we'll have some questions.
But one other point, I just want to come
Yeah.
back to Claude's central point.
Yes.
And you hear the Holocaust now, and this was a very important point that he made. You also think Palestinian, not because it's a Holocaust, that's not the point. But everyone who goes to these Holocaust commemorations, which are becoming more and more hollow, if they're aware of life, also are thinking Palestinian. That changes everything. And Claudio put his finger on that you can't erase that memory, even if you're erasing it. You know, it's like the chalkboard where you have something really wonderful and powerful on the chalkboard and you're erasing it and everybody's saying, hey, you're erasing it. You're erasing it. So the Holocaust can't be discussed today without the memory of what has happened and is happening to Palestinians. It's done. That's what it is. How do you name it?
Okay. Thank you. Professor Claudio, you want to respond and also ask your other questions?
Yes. And the beautiful way that, and the powerful way that Professor Ellis talked about borders in regards to Palestinians is fantastic, because he's not trying to engineering limits and boundaries around the Jewish identity or faith, but he goes right to the heart of it, which is, so when you talk about boundaries, and then he talks about the Palestinians, is not about they are here, we are here, they are inside of us. And that shifts everything. When they are inside of us, as he's saying, so then when you erase the Palestinians, you're erasing yourself. And I think that's what he's screaming at all his life. He said, we are erasing ourselves by erasing somebody else, the same way that we have been erased all along. So it becomes a circularity of erasure, of crossing, of destruction, of self-destruction in some ways. Second thing, Professor Ellis, is that when I read you, I don't know why, but it always comes to me Walter Benjamin's Angel of History. And, you know, for those who are not aware of Walter Benjamin, he has this image of the angel of history in which he says this: his face is turned toward the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before his groans skyward. The storm is what we call progress. If it seems to me that the liturgy of destructions are ways of looking back and seeing the pilage keeping going, and the piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls in front of one's feet, and it seems that the liturgies of destruction is already so much there, but you have this sense of the Walter Benjamin, which is much larger sense of history, which the wreckage that we see has to be somebody else's wreckage as well, and not only our own. And sometimes I see your work as doing what the angel is doing, trying to awaken the dead. Awaken the dead, knowing too well what has been smashed, and that cannot be whole again, even if paradise has ever been a project of wholeness. So now I wanted to turn the edge of history towards the future, and what is the and in terms of the climate collapse and the apocalypse, and the liturgy of destructions that are on the way already, and we are in the midst of those liturgies. I guess perhaps I have two questions then. One is, do you see any relation with your work in a more expansive way as the angel of history of Benjamin? And second, in order to look back, we have to, so the angel has this is back to the future. As he's moving into the future, what is the positionality of the angel of history in your own thinking, Professor Ellis? Is he looking back? If we turn him to the future, what happens to the angel? What does he see? And so that's the work of the prophetic in some ways, the angel of history, and your work that I see. But I'll love to hear you say.
Yeah. So where's the positionality of the angel of history? Yeah.
This is very, with Claudio, a very, very important, he's asking me questions, but he's actually making points. It seems like he's referring to me, but he's actually leading the discussion, which I love. Yeah, Walter Benjamin and history and the storm blowing in from paradise. That's interesting because a lot of the areas which we think of as paradise near the ocean are going to be inundated, like the Philippines and like where I live. I'm 3 blocks from the beach. In 10 years, I'll be on the beach. And 10 years after that, I'll be in the water. And we have a saying here, another day in paradise, except when hurricanes come and climate change comes. Yeah, what is progress? Progress has brought us many places, including here, to the catastrophe. But here's another point I want to make, and having seen Claudio's posts and talking with him, I want to try to bring in an element of hope. The idea of remembering the catastrophe as giving meaning to our catastrophe is also a place of resistance and hope. So that when we're inundated by all this information, this scientific information, and hyped on Facebook and other virtual mediums, and quite true, we can get this thing of doom scrolling. People are talking about, I just learned that term, another image, but I didn't create it, a doom scrolling. And even Amy Goodman it's all hyped up. And a lot of it's true. But what do? We are not approaching the end of humanity. This is wrong. There are going to be many, many casualties, as there has been throughout history. But we will struggle through. How are we going to do that? We have to be signs of hope, not false hope, not cheap hope, not what I call resurrection Sunday hope. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but some of it's too cheesy. Like you're walking out of McDonald's and Jesus has an arm around you, these evangelicals. But I don't want to blame the evangelicals because a lot of them have really working toward justice. So when we get into catastrophe, we have to carry that weight as a sign of hope. The prophet is doomed. That doom is a sign of hope. That seems contradictory. But for Christians, for instance, you have Jesus in the liturgy who is doomed as a sign of hope. Now, some of it's cheesy, I believe, and you hear the birds chirping in the background. This is a terrible death, and all prophets are doomed in different ways. But the prophet ultimately is a sign of hope, and that means that the doomed prophet, the prophetic community gathers around the doomed prophets. And now we gather around the doomed prophets, not the doomed prophets. So for instance, I know Claudio loves Abraham Joshua Heschel. Well, what's he doing with him? He's Jewish. And Heschel was a prophet. And he seems to be very important to many Christians. Well, that changes our sense of the doomed prophets in the community that gathers around these prophets, not just prophet. And this is what I call the new diaspora. And so, but without the past, we deconstruct the past, we deconstruct our traditions, we deconstruct. We're like a deconstruction company. No. At some point, we have to construct. And some of the ancient images that are tarnished by all sorts of things are very important. Isaiah, Ezekiel, Elijah. These are very important images that can be deconstructed, but need to remain with other images. Dorothy Day, Adrienne Rich, there's a new biography coming out about her. So we expand. Gustavo Gutierrez. So the liturgy of destruction can not only be about destruction, it has to be a sign of real hope and struggle.
Okay, thank you for that, Professor Ellis. Now I'd like to turn to Professor Carvalhaes, Cláudio, if for your other question, and maybe you could also talk about the Christian response.
Yeah. I think the last question to Marc would be a more personal one, because he lives the exile in his body, right? His body is exiled. His soul is exiled. His life is a testimony to the liturgies of destruction, right? He is a part of the liturgy of destruction as well, because of his prophetic witness, that if you get into that zone, if you get next to Mount Sinai, you get burned. And he's got burned as well. And so you have thought in such a expensive horizon way, right? And you have given us so much, and you continue to give. That's the fantastic thing. And as you move and the shifting of your writing helps us to see the changes of the prophetic style, and it is fascinating. So my question, and then I'll go into the Christian thing quickly. You have your own. I wouldn't say a synagogue, because you're beyond that. You have your chapel, which is an interreligious chapel, the Chapel of Love, that you invite us almost every day to go join you in some form of prayer. And now with your art, you're giving us not only the pictures that you take, but you also give us your art. And so as the rabbi of your own Chapel of Love, and I call rabbi not in a loose way here, because I'm taking upon your own story of how Edward Said has made you a rabbi. So as a rabbi, so I take Edward Said as a prophet and someone who would have the power to make you a rabbi. So I call you a rabbi at this moment. and to ask you, as a rabbi in your chapel of love, who sits there in your chapel of love, Marc? What are the liturgies of destructions that you remember when you were there? What does memory do to you and your chapel of love? And who are there sitting with you? And you mentioned already some, but now who are sitting? And if the book that you mentioned of the Liturgy of Destruction talks about the apocalypse, what is the apocalypse that you see now? So those are the questions. In regards to the Christian sense of the liturgies of destruction, I think we can, as Christians, I think we have to make great differentiation here. I would say that see, without the Jewish scriptures, Christians would not have the words to deal with lament, with catastrophe, with destruction. So everything that we know in terms of the grammar of the Christian faith comes from the Jews. What would we do without the Exodus, liberation theologians? What would we do without the Psalms? Christians would not have. See, here's the thing: the Psalms is about emotions and feelings and the circularity of feelings. And Christians would not have that expensive notion of feelings and ways of wrestling with the soul, the ways that the Psalms show us, if it was not for the Psalms. What would we do without the laments of Jeremiah? And even if it gets you closest to a Christian notion of words of disaster, going to Jesus, my God, why have you forsaken me? Actually, that was pronounced by a Jew. So we actually don't have much of the language for prayer if it was not for the Jews. So, and there's the complication, because the Jews are all inside of us, but that has been a sense of the destruction of the Jews as a way of self-destruction as way. And so that what Professor Ellis has already mentioned so much, and how we have become, because of the guilt of having killed so many Jews, and our guilt makes us enablers of the destruction of the Palestinians, which Professor Ellis again tells us again and again, and we cannot handle it. But there is this guilt, because is not only guilt out of nothing. We have 2,000 years of history. When we have our most beloved Martin Luther, when talking about the Jews, right? He says, like, what then shall we Christians do with this rejected and condemned people, the Jews? Their synagogue should be set on fire, and what does not burn must be covered over with earth, so that no man will ever see stone or cinder of them again. Their houses are also should be razed and destroyed. All their prayer books, see how prayer books are important? All their prayer books should be taken from them. So this is the history that we carry, right? And so in that way, we do not do the liturgy of destructions the way that Professor Ellis is and Roskis are talking about. But to differentiate, we are the ones who create the liturgies of death. We are the ones who have been also killed so many people, and that is the history that we carry. And I think we have not come to the point where we have yet done well with that. Surely there have been every event is filled with contradictions, right? And there is the liturgies of life out of Christianity. But as for me, it's hard to find in the official ways. So if we are to connect the liturgies of destruction of the Jewish kind, I think the only way to go there is to go where the minoritized and the oppressed people are. I was once talking with Professor James Cone, and I was so frustrated with this thing called church. And he said, you know, Cláudio, the church is very small. The church is a tiny group, and it happens here and there, because that's what we call the gospel is happening in small places. And I think you can only find the liturgies of destruction in a way of 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 the destruction of people that can put you at risk, at real risk, only when you are with the oppressed. So the book, The Liturgies from Below, is an attempt to get to what Professor Ellis is talking about. And we can only get there when we hear to those who cannot be heard. That's why they are not in the liturgical books. The liturgical books are our liturgies of death in some ways, because in some ways it is like what Benjamin said. So the liturgies, the liturgical books, the official ones, are documents of civilization, right? But again, with Walter Benjamin, every document of civilization is a document of barbarism. And so there are documents of barbarism in that way. And I think the only way to do that, it is to go where the people who are destroyed, who have been destroyed, are. So that's why I think there is some similarities, and there are political dynamics that are different, religious specificities that are different, historical differences between the liturgies of destruction and the liturgies from below, so to speak, that have to be distinguished. But I think there is something that can be correlated there, which is it depends on the ability of Christians to read the Jewish prophetic, but read in a way that you do not know for the sake of tradition, but for the sake of somebody else. Mm-hmm. When you take somebody else within you, and now you're fighting for somebody else as if this other person is within you, just like what Professor Ellis said, the Palestinians are with me, and if I don't fight for the Palestinians, I cannot be Jew. So in that way, if I don't do that part, I cannot be my own self, because my own self it's in front of me and is being destroyed. So historically, I think there are ways in which we can the Jews, the Palestinians, and the indigenous people and the Black people, I think there's ways in which they can be put together in these liturgies of destructions when they are called by different names and actions. They're all in some way or another poor, heathens, dark, evil, dirt, irrational, uneducated, disgusting, scary, cursed, lazy, raped, ghettoed. They have their lands taken, they're tortured, they're murdered. In some ways, there is this collectivity that makes them belong to the liturgies of liturgy, because they all know that they are under impeding death. They feel the breath of impeding death every day. They have to search for the next meal. They are destroyed. They are always expected to give or to work for somebody else or to be killed. They're always at risk. Their bodies are temples burnt. Their leaders continually taken. They are exiled in unbelievable places. And they live under the very many forms of necropolitics. So I think that there's ways in which we can relate to the liturgies of destruction, but it has to be first the undoing of ourselves, the eraser of a certain tradition that has enabled us to destroy, to kill others, and we have to undo that in order to get close to where the Jews are in their liturgies of destruction.
Thank you, Professor Claudio. I'll go back to your response after Professor Ellis's response to your Chapel of Love question. But maybe later, I would like to ask you if that, Christian liturgies, as you said, has a lot of liturgies of death in it, and what is needed is to dip into the Jewish prophetic, but also to include as many voices as possible, the indigenous peoples, the poor. Now, that is good. That's the way forward. However, I think a lot of obstacles has to do with the liturgy as, trying to stabilize or deflect. So what could be, for example, I have many people here listening to us who are liturgists or maybe involved in the creating liturgies. How could they create liturgies that is so inclusive, at least for the Christians, and does not, doesn't stay complacent or so that's my question later before we open the forum for questions. That would be the last. So Professor Ellis, who's in your Chapel of Love? Who sits with you?
Well, a lot of interesting people do. They drop by, including Jesus. And of course, the prophets, Isaiah is sometimes there. And there are ravens that fly around my chapel, Elijah's ravens. And of course, Rosemary Ruther and Dorothy Day and Adrian Rich and Gustavo Gutierrez. Edward Said drops by once in a while, and it's wonderful to see him again. We have all these folks that I have met and encountered, and people whose names I don't even remember, but I remember the encounter when I was shouted down and someone defended me, or when we both witnessed something, somebody in the audience that was really just unreal. What is going on here? I remember these 10, 20 years or 30 years later. So there's a lot of memories and the beauty of the sky and the ocean and the beach and people that I meet on the beach, simple people who went to college or didn't go to college and who, and sometimes these people, last night I had a dinner here at my condo for me, and they were people, I don't even know if they went to college, and they were much more hospitable to me and caring about me than faculty at the place that I ran into Ken Starr, who welcomed me as a prophet, but never invited me to dinner or came to me when I needed people. So lots of folks visit the Chapel of Love, and I'd like other visitors too. But not Martin Luther. He's not. No, I really don't think him.
He's excluded?
Well, I don't want to say. I try to forgive everyone that I can. Maybe that's for my own sense of not being totally isolated. I'm not sure if it's a moral decision or a survival decision. But Martin Luther would have to pay up big time. Pope Francis, somebody just messaged that. I'd love to have a chat with him. And even John Paul II. I have, but to see that when Claudio brought up Luther, it's very interesting. Why did he want to stamp out the Jews? Here's a guy who's railing as a Catholic against the abuses of the Catholic Church. What's on his mind with Jews? Not only Jews. He was an equal opportunity hater. Now, when I see a Lutheran minister and with the big cross, and I think, how can you do that? And now I do know Lutheran ministers, including Palestinian Lutherans. My God. So he wanted to erase those who were criticizing his self-righteousness. Luther was one of the most self-righteous critics in history. And he wanted to erase those who, by their mere presence, this is what Claudio's talking about too, the poor by their mere presence make it unstable. Jews for Christians have made their roots unstable because Christians expropriated Jewish. What Claudio talks about, how would Christians lament without the Psalms and all, that was stolen from us. That was expropriated property, and still is. When I hear especially white European and American Christians pontificate about the Bible, I think, give us back our property. Now, when Claudio says it, his traditions, his native traditions, were also expropriated by Christianity. So that's where I have a bond. Okay, so we don't want to keep on that because it's endless. What do we do with this stuff? It's endless. Now, on the other hand, we are here. And we have these fragments and remnants of our traditions, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hindu. It's all fragmented. They're all remnants. That's all that's left. What do we do with that? And so in the new diaspora, where exiles from around the world in culture and religion and all gather in their own way, we share with each other these fragments and remnants, not to make me a Christian or not to make someone Jewish or Hindu or Muslim, but on our journey, there may be something that I can share from my remnants with someone else that gives them life or helps them on their journey. And I have been helped by many of these people who visit me in my chapel have helped me. Edward Said helped me, not only me, but other Jews. Dorothy Day helped me, not only me, but others. Gustavo Gutierrez helped me, not only me, but others, and many Jews. So we share at crucial moments parts of our tradition that are no longer whole with each other. And we remember that sharing. And today is an example of it. But Martin Luther, there's a gate there. He's got to check in. And people like him. Yeah. We have a system at the Chapel of Love that also has a gate. I don't see the gate in my photos, but I have one that can appear when certain historical personages, but not Jesus, because Jesus has very little to do with Christianity and Christian history. So Jesus is welcome as a Jew, a prophetic Jew. No question about Jesus entering. But Christians who carry his cross like a bludgeoned instrument against others, there's a gate there. You got to check in. You got to confess. And we all need to confess, don't we? And now Jews need to confess and repent for what we're doing and have done to Palestinians. So in the Chapel of Love, we're all in the same boat. But there is a gate, and that's a boundary.
Yeah. Okay. That's a very important symbol. Okay. So before we before we open this forum for questions or for comments, my last question is for Professor Claudio. As I said, liturgy is supposed to comfort us, to console us. But how do we do that without, erasing or denying things? How could it be consoling and yet unsettling? That which is very important to make it meaningful.
That's beautiful. I would say that it's always a liturgy is always a movement of contradictions, right? And it is not only a movement of certainty. It's not. I think we need to learn with what Professor Ellis said about the unstable God that in Christianity we cannot deal with. We have to have the God who is the
Constant,
Alpha and Omega, and does not change, the omnipresent, omniscient that takes care of everything. oh, if we go to the Jewish faith, it's not there, right? And I think we need. I think that's why Christians. I think one of the things that Christians lack the most is faith, because you cannot be in a place where there is instability, there is not knowing, there is not control. There's always control and power dynamics there. That's one thing that I think that's why we are so tied up with structures of domination, structures of killing, structures of controlling in our history. Another thing that I think we need to learn is also this ability to relate to God without being afraid of. And just look at Job. Uh, uh, you know, we cannot do what Jews do, is like put your fist up and tell things to God. We're so afraid we cannot do that. God's going to smash our heads if we do that. And in Professor Ellis is right, because in many ways, and every Sunday, every day this happens, we take the Jewish scriptures as if it is ours, as if it is by some way of God we can use it without care in the ways we want. And the same way that we should be careful with other people's traditions, we must be careful with the Jewish tradition, how we are using it, with whom. One thing that I tell my students, if you want to use somebody from another tradition, you have to make the people of the other tradition your own elder. And so unless the prophets trouble you, you cannot use the prophets. Unless the prophets teach you to lose everything, and then you cannot use the prophet. So in that way, how you handle it. If you do not listen to Professor Marc's take on the Palestinians, don't use his word, because you'd be an attempt against his own commitment. So how do we do that? I think it has to do with how we understand tradition. We often see tradition as a way of keeping something, right? But tradition is not to be maintained. Tradition is to be a dynamic event. So the Catholic theologian Orlando Spin talks about the traditioning of life, which is to encompass the many possibilities of his Catholic Hispanic theologian here in the United States. And it has a very expansive notion of tradition as well. So I think tradition can only help us if it is in movement, and if it takes you away from your own boundaries, if it takes you beyond what you believe, and not to keep you in where you believe, but to take you beyond. So if my Christian faith helps me to get rid of Christianity, I think that's when Christianity has its most powerful point. Or if you are a Buddhist, that you can be everything else but a Buddhist, or everything else but a Jewish. That's when you're fully into your perhaps your own tradition. So I think all of this for me has been a wrestling and the trouble in ways that Christianity has done things, and so I've been changing it in so many ways. So this, how do we do that? I think the only way to listen to the cries of God in the people is to go in places of suffering, where people are abandoned. That's the only place. I don't think the churches have much to say, even though we are all now squeezed into this 99% against the 1% of the world, and we are all destroyed in so many ways, and we are losing every day, right? And I think there's somewhere, when we finally get to the point where we come to the point that we say we are all the nobodies of the world, that's the only way that we will be able to speak of something that can truly comfort us. So when I went to the Philippines and South Africa and Jamaica and Italy to hear the refugees, that's where I heard the gospel that I never heard. And so when these people here, the poor on the ground, when they use the Psalms, I think I said they got it. Because it's not only for the comfort of the day, it is for the clinging to dear life that is passing away. It's a different perspective. And so that's and not settling into any place. So that's why I forgot to ask my question, say, what is the dystopic solidarity that I'm trying to figure out in my own work? How is that? If we go from liturgies of destruction to the dystopic solidarity that Professor Ellis said, where will we be? And I think that's what Christians have to do, to figure out with Professor Ellis what is this dystopic solidarity to keep on moving together.
Okay.
So what a joy to be here, and I would take anything to be with Professor Ellis anywhere, because it's always a gift. Always he challenges us, and it's always fantastic. It always brings a dissonance to anything we thought we have settled. He turns it, and then and that has not only repercussions in our mind, but in our bodies. So he's talking is a movement that happens like a typhoon, just that you're going through now, in our bodies. So it's always like that. And so I think to end, and Professor Anu is one who's doing those liturgies of solidarity and resistance there from an indigenous perspective, and it's powerful. I have very little access to it, but the little I see, it's powerful what he's doing there. And so that gives me the hope, not the cheap hope or the cheap faith or the cheap grace that we know, but one that is grounded in roots that can really transform. So I think our task would be, I think the liturgies of destruction are not the negative ones. No, they actually collect our past. They put us together, standing again. But I think what we need to do is to see with whom are we doing those liturgies of destructions. Because when we do it with the people from the margins, then we are doing it well. That is the only way that we can sustain and support some forms of hope, when we are with. Liturgy is only done properly if done with somebody else that I do not know, that are suffering, that are in pain. That is what it is. So I think that's when the liturgy of destruction becomes in itself a liturgies of solidarity, liturgies of resistance, liturgy of dystopic solidarity. And that's what I'm looking forward now, to do this liturgies of dystopic solidarity. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And we'll look forward to more of your reflections on dystopic solidarity. Okay, Professor Ellis.
Well, I want to thank you, Professor Coy, and of course, Professor Claudio. I've got to get a hat, and we have to come on together with the hats. I'll look better.
We do.
Yeah, I think the problem with the liturgy of solidarity, which is very important, is that when you are on the upside with those on the downside, what can you say? I've been in these circumstances with Palestinians, say in hospitals. I'm recalling through Beyond Innocence or Redemption, being in Makassar Hospital in 1988 and 89, and being shown around into rooms where the teenage Palestinian boys were shot and brain dead on ventilators, and parents there, and I was asked to speak to them, and what do I say? Or in the Philippines once, I was brought in to talk to labor folks, and they gave me a bullhorn to talk to them because I was tall and white and American. What am I supposed to say to them when the president of the small union each time was being assassinated? And I was then called to talk with this present leader who had to sleep in different homes every night and probably was assassinated too by Nestle, the company. And what do I say to him? I had a discussion about God with him. What does he believe? And he said that the minister that I was with was a representative of God, so that God was with him. And I thought to myself, what am I to say to that? Am I supposed to bring out my theology and Holocaust? No, I just listened. So, and again, it's an unresolvable issue. And I understand Claudio's point. And but I've been there as a Jew, and I want to just be silent. I don't want to say anything, and I don't want to give hope. And yet they want me to give hope. So I've tried to learn how to talk into a bullhorn and give them hope. Quote, give them hope. So, you know, when we're in these situations, and I'll close with this. When I've had Palestinians in my home on the Sabbath, they've wanted to do, and we did the Sabbath prayers as a family, and they wanted me to do the Sabbath prayers around the table. I would not do it in front of Palestinians. But they wanted me to, as a sign of hope, but I couldn't do it because it was a sign of oppression. Now, I'm not saying that my resolution is the right one. This is not I'm saying that this caution is very important. This boundary, here's a boundary. And yet, what do you do in that situation? I've been called, in Pakistan, I was with a bunch of priests and walking into a village. I mean, out of nowhere, what Claudio was saying. And each person in the village came up for a blessing from the priest, and they thought I was a priest. And they put their hand on their head and they blessed them. And then they were coming to me. And I was thinking, please don't come to me. And they did, because they didn't think, is he a priest? They just assumed I was a priest because I was with priests. And so I put my hand on their head. And this was a teaching for me. They wanted my blessing. And instead of going through all of the details about why I couldn't bless them, and that I wasn't a Catholic priest and I wasn't even a Christian, this meant nothing to them. So it's a learning process. And it's not a great conclusion to this, which I've enjoyed very much, but we have to be on guard, but we can't be paralyzed.
That's a great end, Mark. That's it. This caution that we have to have. And what's your last phrase now? We have to what? We have to be guarded, but
we have to be
paralyzed,
but not paralyzed. And I agree with that. And that's where I think it is good to end. So there is a liturgy of solidarity, but my own sense is when I've been part of them, I have felt more alone and more exiled than ever. Now, that's my own personal feeling, and I'm not trying to say it should be our feeling. And I need to learn also to be part of liturgies that aren't mine and aren't exactly what I feel, because it's not only individual, but we need to be cautious, but not paralyzed. And that's what I've said about the liturgy of destruction and ecology. To think of it only as destruction is wrong. We need to work through it. We need to use our ingenuity. We need to keep struggling. We need to have hope that we can get through it and use all of our resources, including science, not to reverse what's irreversible, but to live within and to survive within what is irreversible. Because to give up and simply say the apocalypse is upon us as a giving up is wrong. And this is where faith comes in, and I admire Christian faith in this. Jewish faith is different. We can't, we don't, yeah. Yeah. So that's where I'll end.
Say it. Okay. Thank you. Yes, we have to be on guard because that's true. Even our solidarity can be sometimes be, temptation to triumphalism. Yes. But we shouldn't be paralyzed. And I think the only way to do it is we have to learn. It's an iterative process. Okay. So with that, I think that concludes our very engaging conversation, discussion. So I'd like to thank both of you, Professor Cláudio Carvalhaes and Professor Marc Ellis, for this very delightful and very challenging and very much needed conversation. And thank you for your generosity. It's a pleasure and honor to be hosting you. I learned so much from you both. So and on behalf of our participants, I have several here who would like to thank you. What a blessing to be in this conversation. Thank you very much, Professor Ellis and Professor Carvalhaes. Oh, there's a one from Reverend Era. Thank you, Rabbi Marc Ellis. So in behalf of the participant, thank you so much. And we will, the center will, it has just recorded this conversation, and we will try to, of course, we have to do some editing, but we will put it up on YouTube so for others to also see and benefit from it. So thank you so much, and thank you to all our participants. Thank you so much, and that's it. Have a good day. Enjoy the rest of the day for both of you, and to the Philippine participants, good night, and hopefully we'll all stay safe with this super typhoon coming.
Yes.
So thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all. Thank you. Good to see you, Professor Ferdinand. Good to
Yes,
see you.
thank you
Good to
so much, Claudio.
Thank you, Rabbi Marc.
Thank you so much,
Rabbi Marc.
You have now a new name,
everyone.
Venerable Marc Ellis, the newly appointed rabbi by Dr. Claudio. Nice meeting.
Much love, Carol.
You.
Yeah, thank you,
Yeah,
Marc.
Carol, thank you so